Bueno, if you allow me, I will speak in Spanish
No,
just
no, no, habla
for the beginning.
español, por favor,
For the, okay.
por favor.
Amigos y amigas, encantado de estar con ustedes esta tarde, con Bill Yuri, nuestro maestro y queridísimo amigo. Vamos a tener esta conversación en inglés sobre su libro Possible. La conversación va a ser registrada y luego traducida y puesta para que, con subtítulos en español para todo aquel que quiera acceder a ella. Entonces, vamos a hablar en inglés. Pueden por el canal de YouTube, la parte del chat o por el Facebook, por el chat, enviar preguntas o comentarios a Bill, que Irina Kauchowski, que nos está acompañando, las va a tomar y nos las va a enviar para que podamos incorporarlas en la conversación. El propósito de esta conversación es aprender de Bill sobre su último libro, Possible. Un libro hermoso, hermoso, hermoso libro, como todos los de él, pero con el gran beneficio de que este libro es de alguna manera una síntesis y un producto de sus libros anteriores. No solo una síntesis, sino es un paso más allá que junta todos los libros anteriores. Voy a pasar a inglés para hacer la conversación con Bill y me disculpa. Y nos siguen acompañando, por favor. That is my impression, Bill. This book is, I mean, I know you since the early 90s. I mean, it were like, I don't know, 30 years, 30 something. So, in a way, I was able to see a kind of evolution in your work and in your books. From getting to yes, very much, you know, with recipes to act, with a lot of knowledge and wisdom behind, but mostly in the language of what to do and how, to the last, getting to yes with yourself, going deep into you, touching emotions and perceptions and energies. You know? And this book that goes one step further. Tell us about this book. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning how the idea came to you, but why don't you share with us what is your internal process to make this book come to life?
Mm. Well, Francisco, it's a huge pleasure, first of all, to be able to speak with you and to speak with our friends in Argentina. I have very warm memories of Argentina. And I know maybe people from around Latin America may be listening too. So my heart is there with you. And I remember, yeah, it's been over 30 years that we've known each other and had so many adventures together. And some of the adventures that we had together, I describe in Possible, as you know, our adventures with Hugo Chavez and others. Uh, and this book came to life a few years ago. I like to walk. That's my way of going to what I call the balcony, you know, getting to a place of perspective that we need so much in dealing with the very tough conflicts that we face today. And I was going for a walk with my friend Jim Collins, who is a very well-known author of leadership classics like Good to Great. And he likes to ask good questions. We were high up in the mountains, and he turns to me and he says, Bill, he says, you've been wandering around this planet here for almost 50 years, 45 years, working in some of the world's toughest conflicts. The world right now is getting very conflictual. What could you think you could sum up everything you've learned about negotiation, about resolving conflicts? And this was the kicker, in one sentence. And I said, one sentence, Jim. And he said, yeah, one sentence. He said, he gave me an example from Charles Darwin and The Origin of Species, where he was able to summarize the theory of evolution in a single sentence. Well, I like challenges. So on our next hike up in the mountains, I tried out this one sentence on him. I tried to think about, what were the things that really, for me, feel essential lessons or principles that could help us navigate in these difficult times. And I gave him the sentence, and he said, "Okay, now that you've got the sentence, now go write the book." And so that was the origin of it, was to look back at everything that I've learned, put it in a new context, like you say, go beyond one step beyond. There's an evolution in my own thinking and learning, because I'm a perpetual student. I'm an eternal student of negotiation and of human beings. And I always have this one question, which I've had for the last 50 years, which is, how do we as human beings deal with our deepest differences? How do we find better ways of dealing with our differences than getting into a fight in which everybody loses? As Mahatma Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye and we all go blind. And, that happens more and more today. So how do we find more creative? How do we tap into our own innate human possibilities? That's why the book is called Possible, because I believe in human possibilities. How do we do that was relevant to today, both in our personal lives, our professional lives, and then in the life of our societies and the planet?
Okay, yeah, but what I noticed reading the book is that in comparison to your first books, is that you were, first of all, using more personal stories, more family stories, more I would say, very touching personal family stories in the book. Is nice and very generous on your side. Also, you collect almost all the stories I listened from you over the years, all together. I mean, the book is full of cases and situations that you are put for. But the difference with other books is that you mention emotions many times. You mention to change the mind and the heart of the parties, and half a page later you say to change the heart and the mind of the parties. you mention perceptions and all these words and notions and concepts that are somehow soft knowledge were not in your previous works. Tell us about that. Why?
Yeah, it's a result of learning. And I came out of the academy. I came out of universities, and and in universities they prize the head, of course, and you present things more rationally. Even in getting, yes, we talk about emotions, but you're right, it was in a different tone. And also, what I've learned is that what we need most of all right now to deal with the differences that we have in the world is, well, we need to employ our hearts and our heads. It's both. It's not either or. It's both and, of course. And there's an old saying that the greatest distance in the world is the distance between the head and the heart. And in fact, that's often what we're trying to travel in a difficult conflict, is to bring people more into a place where they can tap into the deepest part of themselves, because as things get more difficult, we have to get deeper. And the reason why I use stories, in particular my stories, is I thought, okay, what can I share that's about what I've really learned? And where I've really learned my deepest lessons is, of course, in my own experience, right? Rather than talk about the experience of others, which is important, but I chose in this book to really dwell on my own experience. And of course, the most difficult conflicts I face, and perhaps any one of us face, are not the conflicts, however difficult it might be to negotiate with Hugo Chavez, it's to negotiate with your family, with yourself. This is the paradoxical thing about conflict, is that the more internal the situation, the more difficult people perceive it to be. And that's certainly true for me.
Yeah, and it is. Yeah, please go ahead.
Now, the only thing I'll say is that there's something about, in this book, I really tried to, I have a framework, I have a journey, there's a framework, there's a map, but the stories are what really communicate, because they communicate nuance, they communicate context, they communicate the things that are, you might not be able to communicate with just a methodology, a way that people get an aha. Oh, that's it. That's what I'm looking for, is those ahas of like that little shock of recognition of from your own experience, of, oh, that's what works. Oh, that's why it works. Because it's not about recipes in the end. It's much deeper than that. It's a way of, it's a mindset, it's a way of being, it's a way of feeling that you bring into these situations, because they're very complex, they're very unpredictable. Human beings, we are not just rational creatures, we are probably mostly emotional creatures. So if we're going to deal with our differences, we have to reach people through the emotions as well as through the mind.
Yeah, that is another thing that struck me reading that how less attention are you putting to the structural causes of conflict and the actual facts about inequalities or power imbalances or abuses or whatever in the conflict is, and how much focus you put in the idiosyncrasy of the parties, in the feelings, in the way they look the universe, the way they feel, the way they think, how you look inside the individual to explain the point that you are showing. No, if you allow me, I will put the circle because it's a beautiful map. It's a very beautiful map to use, that I really want the people to know that this is in the book, is very good. These are the questions. This is The Circle of Possibility by William Ury. Now, and everything starts in the balcony. And I like it very much. You define it as a victory with ourselves, when the focus is on I, myself. And the zoom in chapter is incredibly beautiful. I know it is. There was a lot in getting to yes with yourself, but this time you make this, and you use these sentences. Like in the pause, you say a pause to, how it is, the pause to choose and a choose to pause. Why don't you explain a little the balcony, zoom in and zoom out? Because we know this, the ideas behind this. We read your books, but you put something else here.
Well, if you think about it, the conflict is in the middle of the circle there, those two arrows facing each other, right? And then we tend to focus right there in that little black space there. And of course, there's not much space, and it doesn't seem, somehow the idea of looking for possibilities, when after all these years, people ask me, working in Middle East and Ukraine and Korea and Colombia and Venezuela, all these places, the Cold War, you know, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? And I like to say, actually, I'm a possibilist. And in other words, I like to say, I don't know what the future brings. No one knows what the future brings, but I know what exists right now in the present, which is there are these possibilities inherent in any situation that we might not see. But if we can expand out into the circle of possibility, then you might see things that you might not have imagined before. And you can help the parties find those if you're a mediator, as many of you are. And it all starts with the balcony, as you were mentioning. It all starts with the balcony, which is just this metaphor for a place of calm and perspective where we can keep our eyes on the prize. In other words, what's most important to us, what's most important to the parties, the underlying interests, the underlying needs, the underlying drivers, the underlying motivations, and see the larger picture. So balcony, to me, is an inherent human superpower. It's inherent in all of us. We just need to wake it up, as it were. And it begins with pausing. As you say, we stop, we pause in order to make a choice. Because all too often, what I've found is that the biggest obstacle to any of us getting what we want in a negotiation is not what we think it is. It's not the difficult person on the other side of the table. It's not the difficult parties. It's right here. It's me. It's ourselves. It's our own very natural, very human tendency to react. And when you react, you often react out of fear, out of anger, and you have no choice when you react. It's just, you have no choice. But if you can pause, the beauty of a pause, and we all have our favorite ways of pausing, then in between the stimulus and the response, there's this little gap. And in that gap lies the ability to choose. We can stop to choose, and we can choose to stop. We can choose to stop, and we can stop to choose. So that's right there from the very beginning. That's where you begin to open up possibilities. Right there in that very little infinitesimal moment that some people, everyone has their favorite way of going to the balcony. It might be to breathe, even just a little moment of silence can make all the difference. I like to go for walks. Some people like to go work out. Some people have a coffee with a friend. Whatever it is that you use to go to the balcony, to that place of calm and perspective where you can kind of really see things from a little bit of a distance. The balcony is that metaphor where you're negotiating on a stage and part of your mind or your heart goes to a mental and emotional balcony, a place of perspective. That little mental, emotional, even spiritual state is that's where new possibilities emerge. And so it all starts by stopping. That's the best way to start a negotiation, is to stop. It's to pause.
How you start? Stopping.
That's it.
Excellent. And then the bigger picture. Zoom in to yourself, the interest, the underlying needs. I like the way you use the future and you use the questions. I mean, you put in this book a series of questions in many different cases, and you show in the writing the power of questions.
Right.
Why don't you elaborate a little more about
For
this?
sure. We often think of negotiation as making statements. Okay, I'm going to make a statement, then you make a statement, and I make a. But actually, for me, effective negotiation is even more about asking the right questions. Because by asking the right kinds of questions, open-ended questions, you can reframe, you can get new perspectives, you can move the spotlight, from, the blame game to how do we deal with it? And as you mentioned, you can move the spotlight from right now, everything seems to be constricted, no way out. But if you move out to the future, You move 10 years out or 20 years out and just expand your perspective. I find in a lot of conflicts, people can't agree at all right now about the situation. But if you say, think about your children for a moment, let's say it's 10 or 20 years out now. What kind of future do you want for your children together? Then people can think, well, we want our children to be well. We want them to be this. We want them to be happy, educated, whatever, healthy, safe. There's a lot more agreement on that. And then you can then, on the basis of that, come back to, okay, so how do we begin? What do we need to do today to build that kind of future for our children? So that little zoom out, it's almost like a camera. We have these, like a camera lens can zoom in, zoom into the, really deep. What do people really want? But then can zoom out and take that larger perspective. Look at the future, for example, is one way of zooming out.
Excellent. Excellent. So the balcony is a place to stop, to choose. It's a place to zoom in, go deep, and it's a place to zoom out and get the bigger picture. And these movements are in sequence, you say, no?
Yeah,
there is a sequence here, a kind of sequence.
Exactly. It may not always be a temporal sequence because you go back and forth, but it's a logical sequence. You cannot zoom in unless you've paused. Pausing allows you to zoom in. Pausing and zooming in allows you to zoom out, because when you pause, pausing is like the foundation. Without that, you can't zoom in and zoom out, right? You've got to stop first in order to, look within, zoom in, figure out what's really wanted here. What are the true interests here? What are the true drivers? What do people, what it really matters to people? And once you've zoomed in and identified what matters to people, then you can zoom out and say, okay, so what are the strategies? What are the scenarios? What are the ways in which you could actually meet the interests of all sides? So pause, antecede, zoom in, antecede, zoom out. And then once you do that, then you zoom out, you pause, you zoom in, you can go free form, but it all starts with pausing. You can't do anything unless you pause first.
Okay. Also, you incorporate in the idea that assumptions, our own assumptions, usually limits our perspectives, no?
Right.
And in order to know your assumptions, you need to pause and zoom in.
That's it. Absolutely.
No?
You've got to, we assume many things. We assume, for example, one simple assumption in negotiation, we assume that the goal is to reach agreement.
Yeah.
But is that really true? No, I would suggest the goal in negotiation is not always to reach agreement. The goal in negotiation is to satisfy your interests, the interests that you've uncovered by zooming in, because sometimes it can be a perfectly satisfying negotiation if both sides come to the table, they realize that, each can do better by going off and making agreement with someone else.
With their own BATNA.
With their own BATNA, exactly. BATNA is something that you get by zooming out. You zoom out and say, it's not just the agreement. You have a BATNA, you have a plan B, you have other alternatives. And that could be fine. Sometimes people are better off without an agreement. Because the thing is, people sometimes they reach agreement that are worse for them than their BATNA. Yeah. Worse for them than their alternatives, or so that's why it's so important to question our assumptions. We sometimes, in the book I give an example of my very first big negotiation where I was involved in between coal miners and the managers and in the coal mines, and there were bomb threats and guns and strikes and the workforce was jailed, and it was very tense. And, our assumption was if we get agreement with the union leadership and agreement with the management, we can solve this. Well, we got an agreement, only to discover that the agreement was rejected by the miners themselves. Our assumption was you work with the union, you work with the leaders on both sides. No, there's not just one table in the negotiation. There are actually at least three tables. There are the internal tables of each side. And what we neglected, we thought the union leadership spoke for the miners, and in some sense they did, but in another sense, we reached an agreement, and then there was a vote by the miners, and almost unanimously they rejected the very agreement that their union leadership had reached, not because it wasn't a good agreement. Again, that was the assumption. If you get a good agreement, that'll be enough. No, it's because they didn't trust management. And anything that management put their signature to, it must be a trick. It was too good to be true, so just reject it. And so you need to be able to see that larger picture. By how? By zooming out, by saying, okay, it's not enough just to talk to the leaders. I had to go down inside the mine and talk to them and listen to the miners, because they were the true decision makers.
Yeah. It's beautiful, that example, especially the story that you go telling us, sharing with us as a young professional going down in the mines. I love that image of you persisting and taking the risk of going down. And I very much like the whole story. Very, very. And I also like that you started saying that was my first big failure.
That's right. My first big failure. Exactly. I have lots of failures. We learn from our failures. Failures are just simply occasion to learn lessons. And believe me, in these very difficult negotiations, you have many more failures, at least in the immediate, than you have successes. As one mediator, I quote George Mitchell, said, he worked on Northern Ireland between the Catholics and Protestants and the wars. And he said, I had 799 days of failure and 1 day of success. And that was the Good Friday Accords that actually transformed that conflict, which lasts to this day. So you can have 799 days of failure, 1 day of success. That's good enough.
Yeah. Bill, just to go quickly over the circle, you just mentioned trust in recently, and the bridge. Even you mean you add the golden bridge. The gold of the bridge seems to be that core issue. No, how
Right.
do you find the gold to build a golden bridge with the other?
Right.
It is trust. Because many times you have very good will, and you actually want to be collaborative, and you persist, and you listen, and you make good questions, etc. But it's difficult to bring the other to the victory with the other side, between us, you say.
Yes. So, very simply, the model is a very simple model, not easy, but very simple in its essence, is that in order to deal with the challenging conflicts that we find today at all levels, we need actually three things. It's like three magic ingredients in the sauce. You need that first one, the victory with ourselves, which comes from going to the balcony, the ability to influence ourselves so that we can then move to the second victory, which is a victory with the other side, between us, the so-called win-win. It's kind of like, where is there a bridge between us? And what I suggest is we have to go beyond even that, because we need not just a bridge, but a golden bridge, which is sometimes we think, oh no, we've got to be more realistic. I would suggest sometimes we have to be more audacious and really go for what is really going to be attractive, what is true, which is like trust you mentioned, or that really meets the essential basic needs of both sides. Because an ordinary bridge can break. We need a golden bridge. And I take that phrase from from Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War 2,500 years ago, Chinese strategist, and he talked about the art of building the other side of Golden Bridge, and in his, but it's like, how do you make it attractive? Because so often in negotiation, people push each other, right? And if I'm pushing you, what do? You push back, right? And the art is the art of attracting. Instead of making it difficult for the other side, which is what we often do in conflicts, our job is to make it easier for them to make the decision we want them to make. And what that means is listening. As we all know, negotiation is not just about talking, it's about listening, not just listening from our perspective, but listening within their shoes, putting ourselves in their shoes. That's the hard thing, through genuine empathy. The art of creating, of like coming up with creative ideas, and then the art of attracting, of removing the obstacles that are in the way for the other side to make it easier for them to move in the direction you want them to move. And there, to me, the key possibilist exercise as a thought experiment is writing the other side's victory speech. And that, yeah, it's like, I always like, okay, you got a tough situation. So you begin not from here, but you begin from there. You imagine the end. You imagine the goal. You would say, okay, imagine that the other side accepts my proposal. They say yes to my proposal. They say yes, or both sides say yes to the mediated proposal. Now imagine that they say yes, they have to go back to their constituents, to the people they care about, to their voters, to their colleagues, to their union workers, whatever. They have to go back and they have to justify why they said yes. What would be their victory speech? How could they present accepting your proposal as a victory for them? What would be their 3 key talking points? And I find that exercise, again, takes an impossible situation and you suddenly can see new possibilities. It stimulates your imagination. And then you see your job as, how do I help them deliver that victory speech? So once you've identified that, then you can work backwards from there and think about how you get there. So that's the golden bridge. It's the
victory speech.
The victory speech is, to me,
again, there is an incredible dominance of the psychology of the parties.
Yeah.
On this portion of the book, because the victory speech is not some. I mean, the story between Trump and the North Korean leader Kim is beautiful. It's beautiful. I love that story, and shows how to. I mean, the story, the narrative, is a way to represent the psychology of the parties.
Right. That's it.
No? And you are putting all the emphasis there in many of the stories.
It's true. Because we're human beings, in the end. And, in that story, almost nothing was known about Kim at that moment. No one knew anything about him. He was a new leader. He was young. No one had met him. No one knew anything about him. Like the psychology, what does he care about? And so, I didn't know that much. So I just went on Google and I said, okay, who knows anything about him? And the only person I could find out who knew anything about him was a retired American basketball player by the name of Dennis Rodman, who'd been a champion basketball player together with Michael Jordan, on the Chicago Bulls. And it turns out Kim, when he was a high school student, loved the Chicago Bulls. And so Rodman had been over there and they'd been friends. So I decided, if I'm going to learn anything about Kim, I need to track down Dennis Rodman. He's not an easy person to meet. he's very eccentric. I love the story. He's eccentric. So, it took me a while, months, who do you know, whatever. Finally, I got this invitation to a house there in LA and to show up for pizza with Dennis Rodman, but he wasn't there. He was out partying, out, having fun with his friends and his friend, who offered to introduce me to him, said, well, I don't know, maybe you could stay over tonight, cancel your plans for tomorrow, and maybe he comes back in the middle of the night, you can catch him then. And I thought, well, gosh, I had to change all my plans, but I thought, okay, how do I do this? But I thought, look, he's the only one who knows Kim. There's possible nuclear war. We need to find out. Anyway, make a long story short, the next morning, I was able to meet Dennis Rodman at breakfast. He said, bad day, mad day. What do you want? And I said, well, you're the only one who knows Kim. And then in that next hour and a half, he told me the story of how he'd met Kim, how he'd held Kim's baby. He got to know Kim, and then Kim had told him that his dream one day, and this goes back to psychology, as you're saying. Kim said to him, my dream one day is to walk down Fifth Avenue in New York, go to Madison Square Garden, and watch the Chicago Bulls play the New York Knicks. And I thought, bingo, that little tidbit right there is a little insight into someone that no one knew. And it just is revealing that he's very antagonistic towards the United States and towards the West, but he also has this love, and maybe could we make his dream come true? And, it was so interesting to me. And, that helped me write Kim's victory speech. What would Kim's victory speech would be, in which he decided not to go to war with South Korea and the United States, but actually to stay in a peaceful relationship. And so it's those little bits of psychology are critical, are absolutely critical. And we often miss them because we think that everything is about power and resources and everything. Of course, that's all true. But in the end, it's decision makers, and these decision makers are all human beings, and they liked basketball when they were young and whatever. And you've got to find those little avenues into people's hearts.
Excellent. I love that. And that resonates with the work we do with, people. We are working with people, even if they are presidents, dictators, union leaders, or whatever. No, they function as human beings. Huh?
Yeah. Now you remember, when we were meeting with President Chavez, at
Yeah,
one
of
moment,
course. Yeah.
at one moment, we were in his palace there meeting with him. And I asked him, what could the opposition do? Is there anything the opposition could do that would send you a signal, signale, signal that they could maybe begin to be trusted? And he said, you know what they could do? They own the private media. They could stop going on their televisions and calling me a mono. Remember that?
Of course.
And it was like, there was huge conflicts over economics, resources, power, everything like that. But in the end, what he wanted most, he felt intensely disrespected. Mono was like a racist allusion to his indigenous origins. And it was like, you could tell in the end, it came down to respect, that unless you, and it turns out respect may be the cheapest concession you can make in a negotiation. It costs you nothing to show a little respect, but the other side's dignity means everything to them. And so that's a way forward, just to begin that way.
Excellent. And the third station of your circle is the third side. The third side. I love that you included the third side and that wonderful book that you produce, and how to involve the third side as I would say, you introduce power here. The idea of power, how go beyond neutrality, how you create coalitions to push your quest for peace and for peaceful resolution of conflicts. No?
That's it. And you were very instrumental in helping getting that book published in Argentina, as I recall, many years ago. So the idea basically is we have a victory with ourselves, We have a victory with the other side. But oftentimes in difficult negotiations, that's necessary, but not sufficient. We need something more. And that's where the third side comes in, is in terms of power, in terms of influence, is we need help. We need help to go to the balcony. We need help to build that golden bridge. We need a lot of help. And we don't see it often, but that help is around us. It's latent. It's a latent potential. There's a tendency in any conflict. I don't know why our minds kind of shut down, but we start to see everything as two sides, us versus them, right? Labor versus management, this party versus that party. It's always two sides. But in fact, as we know anthropologically, there's always a third side. And the third side is that larger whole. It's the larger community. It's the people around who are affected by the conflict deeply. It could be family, it could be friends, it could be other teammates at work, it could be the society, but there's always that third side. And if you can do, as you were suggesting, build a winning coalition of that third side, that community, no matter how strong one side might be, the community around is always stronger in the end. And that third side can serve as a kind of, this is ancient. Goes back to our ancestors. Every indigenous society in the world knows how to use the third side. Sit down in a circle, convene the community, bring the power of the community, people power, to bear on the conflict, to persuade the parties to find a better way forward than killing each other.
Well, you mentioned many times in the book that you, the reader, take your conflict and think about it, these ideas, and it's impossible not to do it. I mean, and let me tell you that it is very challenging. I was thinking about some of my own conflicts, going through the balcony, the golden bridge, the third side, what you actually need, and what is the victory speech of the other. And it's very, very useful, but challenging, because when you are in a conflict, you want to be in your comfort zone, knowing that you are right and the other is the one who needs to move. So let me tell you that, every piece of your book is very useful for our own conflicts, and also for understanding how we, as third parties, mediators or facilitators or even negotiators, can work better for our what we truly want to achieve, which is not easy, I would say, as you mentioned in your book.
Yeah, this is the hardest work that human beings can do, in my view. No one wants to no one wants to hear things they don't want to hear. No one wants to admit that maybe they're not entirely right. There's an old expression about marriages that you can either be happy or you can be right, but you can't be both. And
it's very good.
And the truth is, how do we shift out of that part of the mind that gets trapped in blame, the blame game, the game of mutual accusations? I remember, gosh, when I was working with Soviets, Americans and Soviets, we would bring them together, policy officials, and every dialogue, it would begin with blame. You Americans, you did this. You Russians, you did this. So I decided, okay, next time we had a meeting, I scheduled a session. The very first session of the 2-day dialogue was the title was Mutual Accusations. And I set it for 6:30 in the morning. anyone who wants to show up for 2 hours between 6:30 and 8:30 in the morning, deliver all your mutual accusations. Everyone else who wants to have breakfast, show up at 9 o'clock. You can skip that session.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, you underline in this book, which was not so eloquent in the previous, the relevance of the environment, the context, the space, the way you create the situations for people to go through change, no?
Right.
And that is also many times. I mean, people don't put attention to that, and it's very very relevant too.
Very important. Yeah.
I have some questions that my colleagues put for you.
Okay.
I will. Yeah. So you already answered some of them. But I wanna be fair with them and put these questions. This one is, well, what motivated you to write this book, and how would you define it? Is a summary of previous knowledge, or is it the result of a new search? We talk a little about this.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
answer is it's both. It's a summary of previous
Both.
knowledge, and it is the result of a new search, because I'm always learning. I'm always
Yeah.
learning, and the world is changing, and what's needed is changing. So it was both. I'm building on what I learned in the past. I'm trying to distill it to its essence, like capture it in a single sentence, and then take it further. What's the new frontier? What's the new frontier of negotiation and conflict resolution? That's what I'm looking for. And I think the new frontier, incidentally, is, we tend to think of negotiation as like individuals, like there's the parties, but there's the individual mediator. I think increasingly we have to think of mediation and everything as a team sport, like football or whatever. It's like a team sport. You need a team, because these conflicts are so complex.
Yeah.
You need collective intelligence, collective influence. You need the third side. I use the term swarm. It comes from biology, but it's like, bees, or like birds, like small birds. When there's a hawk attacking their nest, 30, 40 small birds will get together and they drive the hawk off, because there's strength in that numbers in that community. So we need to learn to mobilize collective intelligence, collective influence, to bring the critical mass of leverage necessary to transform these really difficult conflicts that we face.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, more practical issues. How do you remember the case you use as examples? Do you keep a record? Because
I do.
I was shocked to see time, names, very, very small details of some situations that I knew.
It's
How do
true.
you do?
Well, I try. Well, the thing is, in negotiation, as you know, it's really important to prepare. So we prepare, you prepare a lot. Prepare. I think it's equally important to learn after the situation, not just to go on to the next one, but to take time to really debrief. And so, yeah, I debrief it. I take notes. I dictate because sometimes it's easier. And so, yeah, so I was drawing on old notes that I had from years ago, because the memory starts to fade, but the notes remain.
Okay. If you were asked to choose a single skill or strength for a good negotiator, which one would you choose?
Well, I used to always say the ability to put yourself in their shoes, the ability to empathize. I call it strategic empathy. It's empathy for a purpose. It's like, just to realize that, you know, in negotiation, you're trying to change the hearts and minds of others, right? How can you possibly change their hearts or minds if you don't know where their hearts and minds are, right? So that's why
Yeah.
that's central. And more recently, I've tended to think in today's times, which are so reactive, there's so much stress, there's so much information coming at us through this little device here, that I now think the key strength we need is the ability to go to the balcony and to help others go to the balcony. Because without the balcony, you can't do anything else.
Yeah. Excellent. Good. Which means to be able to reflect, no?
To be able to reflect.
To be able
Yeah.
to reflect.
That's
Beautiful.
what's in such short supply nowadays, is that time to reflect.
Yeah. Okay. And what are the main challenges for a negotiator in these times?
Well, I mean, I would go straight there again. The challenge is there is, let's say, people are getting more stressed, more reactive, more emotional, more combative in that sense. The negotiations, the conflicts are getting more complex. Many parties, oftentimes across cultural bounds or national bounds, not just interest, but deep-seated values. There's so much complexity. And now we're facing in the world, we're facing what's been called a polycrisis, which is, you know, you have geopolitical challenges in the world, you know, whether that's affecting everybody, the conflicts in the Middle East, the conflict in Ukraine, whatever it is. You have domestic polarization, political polarization that's infecting everything, you know, whole societies are, you know, between right and left, you know, here in this country, in the United States, and I'm sure, and I know in Brazil, and I'm sure in Argentina too, it's just kind of like everything's getting polarized. You then have technological disruptions like artificial intelligence, which is going to change everything, including negotiation. You then have economic crises. You then have environmental crises where the basic relations between us and the environment are shifting, and there are all kinds of crises. And you have them all together all at once. So it's like, wow. The challenges are huge. And so the necessity for negotiation has never been greater, never been greater. And what it requires, as I was mentioning before, is we need new forms of negotiation, even more creative, even more collaborative, even more collective, to figure out how do we navigate these difficult times. We're not going to end the conflicts, but we can transform them. We can change the form, the way in which they're being handled, from destructive to constructive. That's what we can do.
Excellent. I have a question from our common friend Gachi here. She said, "Hi, Bill, what a joy. It is possible to work from internal resources with people whose worldviews reject the link between heart, mind, and emotion to overcome critical political rift."
Give me that question again. Is it because you broke up for a tiny bit?
Yeah, it is possible to work from internal resources,
yeah,
with people whose worldviews rejects the link between mind, heart, mind, and emotions to overcome critical political rift.
Yeah. Really good question. Well, first, a big warm hug to Gachi. And secondly, yes, becomes a greater challenge. People may not, you know, they may not buy into, okay, that, you know, soft approaches or heart-based approaches, none of that. You've got to speak to people in the language that they will hear. And if all they're hearing is, power and mind, you need to start where they are. You know, it's like we, unfortunately, but what it requires for us to do, paradoxically, is we have to be even more in our hearts. we have to be even more inside of ourselves. We have to be even more grounded and on the balcony in order to be able to deal with people who are not that way, right? But you can't use the language of this with them. They're not going to hear that language. They're not going to understand it. They're going to reject it. So you have your language for yourself, and then you have to speak in the language that they will hear. And then bit by bit, gradually, you can often find openings, and, the people who are the most rational, everyone is also an emotional creature too. You can look for those little opportunities where things can shift. I give an example in my book where it comes from President Carter, with whom we both worked, the great man. And he always liked to tell the story of the first Camp David back in 1978. It was like they were just about to reach agreement, and then it all blew up at the last moment, which often happens in negotiations. There's a big blow up at the end. And the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, got furious about some issue, a side letter to do with Jerusalem. And he said, everyone pack their bags, we're leaving. And it looked like the whole thing was a failure. And, Begin was a lawyer. He was exactly what Gachi said, he's a lawyer, very rational, whatever. Not, it's like everything is like, has to be formal, very formal way of conversation. Well, Carter, when it went from his cabin, and they have these little cabins in Camp David, he walked from his cabin over to Begin's cabin to say goodbye. And he brought with him some books, or actually some photographs that Begin had asked Carter's secretary for a little bit earlier, of him with Carter. And he had signed the photographs. And this was for Begin's grandchildren. He had like 8 grandchildren. He signed each one their name, Yidit, Merav, whatever. And then he added a little flourish he didn't usually do, with love, Jimmy Carter, And he gave them to Begin. Begin was very cold, okay, it's all over. There's nothing, very cold, formal tie jacket in the thing. And he said, Mr. Prime Minister, I've asked for these photos. I just brought them. And Begin saw the photo, and then he saw the name of his grandchild. And then he saw, with love, Jimmy Carter. And he started to tear up. He started to have tears in his eyes because he was thinking of his grandchildren. And Carter said to him something like, I was hoping that their grandfather would be able to tell them that together we brought peace for their generation with Egypt. And this is the key thing. Begin he softened his tone, right? Somehow it penetrated that, the exterior, that very formal reserve. It penetrated, and he softened his tone, but he didn't say, no, okay, let's reach agreement. And then Carter said goodbye to him, and he walked back, and he gets back to his cabin, and the phone rings, and Begin says, Mr. President, I've decided to say, okay, we'll go ahead with the agreement. And, that little thing, with someone who, was very rational and formal and legal and whatever, but again, that led to an unprecedented peace between Egypt and Israel that lasts to this day, right now, 45 years later. Egypt and Israel have a partnership, all because that little crack that opened up there at Camp David with someone who wasn't at all used to talking about emotions.
But Bill, what about violence and social injustice and structural causes? What about that? I mean, to say and this was one of the questions of a colleague. If you say it is always possible, it doesn't attack or it doesn't threat the visibility of social injustices or I mean, abuses of violence, etc. I mean, if you say it is possible, to deal with Hamas and to these horrible things that are going on in Gaza. I mean, what about injustice and brutality and violence?
Absolutely. That is the point. That's the problem. In my view, here I am speaking as someone who's spent his life, in the field of conflict and conflict resolution. I actually believe we need more conflict in the world, not less. But why do we need more conflict in the world? I mean, because we need to be able to deal with those systemic injustices. We need to be able to deal with those violations, incredible human rights violations. Only through conflict can we do it. The question isn't about, no, let's just all reach agreement. The question is, how do we deal with our differences? How do we deal with Hamas? How do we deal with all those things? How do we deal with all the atrocities that are going on in the world today? We need to lean into them. So I think we can't avoid them, and we can't just be, optimistic. Everything is, this like it. That's why I say I'm a possibilist. It's like a possibilist is someone who looks at the negative possibilities right in the eye. The brutality, the injustices, the systemic inequities is a realist who looks at the negative possibilities, and then on the basis of looking at the negative possibilities, then says, okay, in the midst of all this, where are the positive possibilities? Where can we make a little bit of progress here, there? Where are the levers of how we do it? So to me, a possibilist is not just a sunny-eyed optimist. And the reason why I'm a possibilist is not because it's just a kind of, it's because I've seen it happen with my own eyes, as you have. I was in South Africa where there was the worst kind of racist injustice, inequity, systemic inequity, anything like that. Blacks and whites. People said this is back in the 80s. People said this conflict is going to go on for generations. The whites had all the power, the White Nationalist Party. How's this going to change? Mandela was in jail for 27 years. But then I watched as the people of South Africa, the third side, the community in South Africa, the business community, the labor community, the community, the civil of women, of university students, of the religious community, came together. The international community supported that and created a container within which within 5 years, the conflict in South Africa was transformed. Were all the systemic injustices dismantled? No. But you had a Black majoritarian elected leader. Nelson Mandela was out of jail. He was the president, and you could begin to shift things. The conflict wasn't over, and you need more conflict to deal with all those injustices. But the war was ended. And the same thing happened in Northern Ireland, in Colombia, where you had, where you had 50 years of war, the government, the guerrillas, millions of victims. It's that hard work of conflict transformation that addresses the systemic injustices, bit by bit, step by step, changes the systems. We need actually more of it. It's not about ending it. It's about transforming it, changing the form. That's the work. We actually need more conflict to come up. We can't suppress these conflicts anymore. We need more conflict, but we need the modalities and the systems and the creativity and the collaboration to deal with that more conflict. And that's really the work of possibilists.
Excellent. Excellent. I think we shouldn't add anything else to that definition of the possibilist. And as always, you come with a word, with a concept, like when you created the third side idea, when this with the possibilist, I think that that is the big field for our work, because we need to create possibilities where there is no hope, no? or where there is no clear future, when there is people suffering, when there are people suffering for conflict or injustices or these kind of things. I very much appreciate your time, Bill.
Yeah, if I may, Francisco, I'm just remembering someone sent me a quote today from a beautiful man whom I met, who's a monk, a Catholic monk, who lives in Austria, who's almost 100 years old, who lived through World War II and all the horrors of it. His name is Brother David Steindl-Rast. And he has a quote that I'd like to leave with here on this subject. He says, "If we shut our hearts to the pain of the world, if we shut our hearts to the pain of the world, our celebrations and our conflict resolutions become superficial. If we so we've got to keep our hearts open to the pain of the world, to all the injustices, to all the things going on." He says, but if we let that pain overwhelm our hope, we're lost in the dark.
Beautiful.
Tears in which pain and joy flow together, tears in which pain and joy flow together, do justice to life in its fullness. So we need both. We need to face the brutalities, the inequities, the injustices of the world, but we can't let that overwhelm our hope, because if we let it overwhelm our hope, we're lost. We need both. And that's what a possibilist does. They look at the negative possibilities and then they look for the positive possibilities. So any of you who are listening to this right now with my friend Francisco, if you're listening to this, you are probably almost certainly a possibilist. And I just want to encourage you to take your own rich potential for curiosity, for creativity, for collaboration, and bring it to these difficult conflicts. Because if we can do this together, we can begin to transform our world for the better.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bill.
It's my great pleasure, Francisco.
Beautiful, beautiful to see you and to share your spirit as it was 30,000 years ago. You are exactly the same, with much more wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye. Bye-bye.